So which is the top-down view? A, B, C, or D? Okay, the answer is C. But more importantly, how did you figure that out? Well, let's go back to our original illustration. We'll take the blue line, for example. It actually doesn't matter which of the lines you take. Let's take the blue one. We need the blue line to connect diagonally to the green line here. So we need that blue line to meet and connect with the green line. But also at its base, we need to have a pink line here and a green line here. So if we look across here, well, the blue line connects to the pink line, so that can't work. And with this diagram here, the blue line connects to the pink line again, so that can't work. With this diagram here, the blue line connects to the green line, so that's good. But the same thing occurs here. The blue line connects to the green line. So let's go back to the one that does work. With C, the blue line also connects to the pink line, so that works, and connects to the green line. So the answer must be C, but just let's check it. The blue line here connects to the pink line, but it doesn't connect to the green line. So we go back to C being our answer. Now, what would happen if that process wasn't available to you? This is Brain Injury 101, and in this presentation, we're going to explain why we may lose some cognitive and physical function after brain injury, like how to join colored lines together, for example. We'll include some basic brain geography. We'll tell you how around 90 billion nerve cells talk to each other, and we'll discuss some of the common challenges faced after brain injury. The bottom line here is very much a positive one in that with the right therapies, the brain can rewire itself to meet the challenges it may face after brain injury. We live in a high-tech world, and I rather like this analogy of how the brain works. The human brain functions as a high-speed internet system. The quality of the brain's connections is key to its speed, to its bandwidth, to its fidelity, and to its online capability. So those 90 billion nerve cells that we were talking about, how they communicate and how smooth that communication is very much dictates how we function as human beings. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of basic brain geography, shall we? You'll be aware that the brain is split into two halves, and the left half of the brain controls the reason and logical side of what we do, and the right side of the brain generally is thought to control the creative side of what we do. You'll also be aware of the fact that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, so they're cross-wired in that sense. And talking about wiring, the two sides of the brain are joined by the corpus callosum, so that enables the two sides of the brain to talk to each other. So the frontal lobes are situated behind the forehead, and we can see them marked here with the eyes here, and the brain stem coming up here, and the cerebellum here. And the frontal lobes, and bear in mind if the brain is split into two halves, you're going to have a left and a right lobe, are responsible for emotion, personality, behavior, executive functions like judgment, reasoning, motivation, and inhibition. The rear portion of the frontal lobes is known as the motor cortex, and this controls voluntary muscle movement. So this is in here is the motor cortex, and this, as we say, controls muscle movement. So sat here behind the frontal lobes and marked in green are the parietal lobes, and the parietal lobes are responsible for integrating the sensory stimuli that we receive all day long into single concepts, perceptions, and thoughts. And if you imagine that we are bombarded with stimuli from the moment we get up to the moment we go to sleep, the parietal lobes work pretty hard to integrate all of that information into single concepts, thoughts, and perceptions. They also coordinate spatial information, which is particularly important for helping us to navigate our way around the world and give us an accurate representation of the world around us. Now the sensory cortex, remember we spoke about the motor cortex, the sensory cortex lies here at the front of the parietal lobes. And the sensory cortex is responsible for processing sensations from the skin, muscles, joints, and tendons. So we've talked about the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, so let's move on to the temporal lobe marked here in green. So the temporal lobe is responsible for processing memories and integrating them with the sensations of taste, sound, sight, and touch in order to form much stronger memory traces. The temporal lobes are also responsible for interpreting sounds as words, and thus the temporal lobes play a really important role in language. So sat here at the back of the brain and here marked in green, just above the cerebellum, are the occipital lobes. And the occipital lobes are responsible for processing information from the eyes. So visual processing is what occurs in the occipital lobes. So we can see the cerebellum marked here in red, sat underneath the occipital lobes, with the brain stem to its left here. And the word cerebellum actually means little brain in Latin, and that's a pretty good summary of what the cerebellum does. It's an extremely important part of the brain's mechanism. So the cerebellum coordinates the motor impulses sent to the muscles in order to produce smooth and precise movements. It also coordinates information from the ears and eyes and the body in order to maintain balance. And of course, that's critical for falls. And the cerebellum is involved in cognitive functions like the ability to seamlessly shift attention from one thing to another. So the limbic system houses a number of areas with which you may be familiar. So the hippocampus is memory central, really. The amygdala pick up on our emotions, the thalamus and hypothalamus. And we've also talked about the frontal lobe a little bit. So the limbic system, as we said, is evolved with emotions, and these can be described as the 5 F's, so feeding, the hunger drive, fight and flight, and our feelings. And then the final F I'll leave to your imagination. The limbic system is also responsible for parts of the autonomic nervous system, and these are the things that we do without thinking about it, so things like breathing and blood pressure and heart rate and bowel and bladder dysfunction or function, etc. So the autonomic nervous system leads us quite nicely onto the brain stem, and you can see the brain stem here in all its multicolored glory sitting nicely in the midbrain. And the brain stem houses a number of our autonomic nervous functions, so breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, etc. And of course, the brain stem is also part of the main highway between the central nervous system, the spinal column and the spinal cord, and our muscles, which allows us to move freely. So how is it all connected then? Well, it's a good question. We know that the healthy brain has around 80 to 100 billion brain cells, so that's a heck of a lot of communication to be doing. Now, these brain cells communicate with each other via electrical and chemical impulses. So we see a brain cell here, we see a passageway, and think of this as a road, if you like, and this is called an axon. And at the end of the axon is a synapse. Now, the signal from the cell via the axon is electrical, but when it reaches the synapse, there's a gap, and the electrical impulse can't jump that gap. So it needs to convert into a chemical impulse, and that chemical transmitter, if you like, is called a neurotransmitter. So the impulse then becomes a neurotransmitter, and then when it's jumped the gap, it then turns back into an electrical impulse and goes on its way. And you can imagine that this is happening at super high speeds. So think about the communication process as being twofold. One is electrical. When it reaches the synapses, it needs to go across that gap. It becomes chemical, and neurotransmitters are involved. Now, when this process is compromised, as it can be in brain injury, and it can also be compromised in neurodegenerative conditions, then we see a failure of sometimes cognitive and sometimes physical function. So there are a number of causes of brain injury, but let's deal with some of the more common ones. So an obvious one is a fractured skull. It can be caused by a blow to the head. So there's an open fracture, which would involve a rupture of the membrane covering the skull, and therefore bleeding will be external and internal. And then there's a closed fracture in which the skull is fractured, but the membrane is not ruptured, and therefore the bleeding is likely to be internal. Then there's a laceration or torn brain tissue. And then there's a contusion or bruising of the brain. Bear in mind that the brain floats free inside the skull, in some fluid inside the skull, and therefore when the skull moves fast, the brain moves fast, and those accelerative forces will cause the brain to bang on the side of the skull, and bruising will occur, and that can lead to brain injury, and whiplash is a good example of that. And then we have hemorrhage, and hemorrhage is a rupture of the blood vessels in the brain, or the blood vessels that supply the brain. And so a hemorrhagic stroke occurs when the blood vessels rupture and oxygen is not supplied to the brain in enough quantity. A diffuse axonal injury, DAI, is a difficult one because these are microscopic tears in the nerve fibers and very often can't be picked up by scans. So this is one that could creep up on you without knowing. And finally, for our purposes, anoxia or hypoxia, so where the brain, as we've said with stroke, is deprived of oxygen, and it doesn't need to be for anything more than about 3 to 4 minutes, brain cells will start to die. So a lack of oxygen or reduced oxygen to the brain can cause brain damage. So we know that the brain is highly interconnected, so an injury to one part may have implications for other parts of the brain and the functions that they perform. But on the upside, the same connectivity may help the brain to circumnavigate some of the challenges that a brain injury presents by using other avenues. There are 4 broad categories of issues after brain injury. There's physical, cognitive, executive, and psychosocial. So the physical issues are likely to include an increase in muscle weakness and therefore a decrease in muscle tone, and this can have implications for movement and posture. Difficulty in coordinating movements, and so we're looking at balance issues here and the potential for falls. Difficulty in planning movements, and this talks to the executive function. Changes in sensation, speech articulation, trying to find the right words. We all do that, but people with brain injury tend to struggle a little bit more to find the right words for the right occasion. And difficulty in moving body parts in isolation. So there are numerous cognitive challenges that brain injury patients may face, but let's deal with some of the more common ones. So a disorientation with regard to time or place or person is quite common, and that's going to depend to some degree. The extent of that will depend to a large degree on the severity of the injury. Memory difficulties and attention problems, and of course those two are very closely linked. So the inability to pay attention for any or focus for any given period of time can cause real issues with memory. The inability to process verbally or visually can of course cause problems with language and searching for the right word or not being able to use the correct language for the correct occasion is a source of great frustration to people with brain injury. So we've talked a little bit about executive function, and that's the ability to plan and organize things. So brain injury patients can struggle with things like goal setting and actually getting started on a project, self-initiation. They can also struggle with evaluation and monitoring, assuming they do get started on project, and flexible problem solving, which is required, of course, for projects, but also for daily life can be an issue. They also can have a lack of self-awareness, and this can lead to social misjudgment in certain situations. And finally, the psychosocial elements of brain injury. So personality changes are quite common, as are a reduction in tolerance and a general irritability that goes with that. Then emotions are much closer to the surface and therefore expressed much more easily. Mood swings are common, and there's a lack of interest in others. Being self-centered would go along with that. And then finally, not surprisingly, anxiety and depression are common with people with brain injury. So in summary, the brain is an incredibly complex computer that relies on the ability of its constituent parts to communicate with each other and with the body. When any of those constituent parts are damaged, there's likely to be an impact on their function. The nature of that impact will, to a large degree, depend on the location and the severity of the damage. The good news is that the brain can functionally rewire itself given the right input and a lot of hard work.